All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new and very interesting new interview here at Room for Discussion. Today we will discuss the implications of a deeply integrated world economy. For example, is there an inescapable trilemma between democracy, hyperglobalization, and the nation state? And how do we get everyone on board for a path towards a saner form of globalization?
Exactly. And not only is the topic of today extremely relevant and interesting, so is our guest. We are honored that one of the key players in the academic debate on globalization has found the time to be here with us for 1 hour to discuss globalization and trade. He has published hundreds of articles, multiple books. He finished his PhD at Princeton. He taught at Columbia University economics, and he's currently professor of political economy at Harvard University.
Yeah, we also encourage you to participate during this interview. You can ask your audience questions over there at the public microphone with Benji. And you can also use Twitter via the hashtag RFD, and that's especially for the people that are watching the live stream at the moment. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to hear a warm round of applause for no one less than our guest, Professor Dani Rodrik.
Welcome. Hi.
Hello.
Mr. Rodrik, once again, thank you very much for being here with us today. It's a true pleasure. To start off, about a year ago, you had an interview with Dutch newspaper NRC, in which you mentioned that there is a clear difference between what economists say to each other and what economists say to the general public and to the audience. We were quite surprised by this quote because we were actually wondering, will you be fully honest with us today here?
Does this count as a public, or does it count like
it's a public event, so it does.
It's between us, but we're between us. We're all honest people, so I will try to be as honest as I can be.
So
and thank you, by the way, for having me here. I think this is a great initiative, and you guys are doing a great job.
Thank you. So I asked this question because we were wondering, what is this tendency that economists aren't honest, right? You would expect that economists say what they think, and they say that to everyone. They want their voices to be heard. So how does this work?
Well, you know, it's interesting, and it's not something that I fully understand myself, but I think at some level, many economists have this view of that there are a lot of barbarians in the public, and that you don't want to empower barbarians by, being drawing all the distinctions and providing all the caveats, and you just want to have a clear message and say, for example, free trade and globalization are good, and we don't want to sort of say that there are all kinds of subplots and side implications and downsides, because then you're going to be empowering the protectionists and all the self-interested lobbies, and so let's not do that.
It was interesting because for one of your first books, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? You even had economists who refused to write an introduction to your book simply because they were afraid that your book would cause trouble, right?
Yeah, so this is, it's a little bit odd, because I think that if we had maybe a little bit more balanced view, if we as economists had presented the much more nuanced and rich view that prevails in our discussions in the seminar room and in our advanced graduate classrooms, that perhaps we might have had a little bit more credibility today in the way that we contribute to the discussion on globalization. And I worry that along with many political elites, that the economics profession also has lost significantly credibility.
And do you think that there has been a lot of change in that, or do you think it's still the same as before the financial crisis? What do you think?
I think there has been significant change. I mean, I think, I'm a critic of economics from within, and I think that there is a lot of value in the economic method. In fact, many people think that I'm just I don't go nearly as far in my criticism of economics as I should. But I do believe that economics is a very valuable discipline. I believe very strongly in the theoretical and empirical methods that dominate mainstream economics. And I think that also allows economics to change over time. So I think a lot of our views in the discipline with respect to the consequences of financial globalization have changed.
Yeah.
Our views on
People now see the danger of financial globalization.
I think that's much more recognized.
Yeah.
So I think that the discipline changes as evidence evolves and as there are more studies. So I'm optimistic on that.
And to add to your view on economics, you wrote a book in 2015 called Economics Rules, in which you praised the amount of variety that we have in economic models. Why are you so determined that this variety is such a blessing rather than a problem for the economics profession?
I think there's a misleading narrative within the economics profession, which in turn gets reflected in the way that the world looks at economics, which is that economics is all about singing the praises of markets. It's all about telling the government to get out of the way.
That's what outsiders think, you think.
And that's what a lot of outsiders think. And I think it is in part rooted in the fact that, as we were talking just a few minutes ago, economists, when they relate to the public at large, they tend to provide a very introductory economics or Econ 101 view of things, where we're so worried that people will not appreciate the magic of the marketplace that we simply sing the praises of markets without necessarily emphasizing some of the other.
But those models use oftenly very critical assumptions that just don't hold in the real world, the models that you just described. So would you then not say that those models should be replaced rather than kept in place? Some of the models.
I think in economics, the way that we increase our understanding of the world is by developing new models that often exist side by side. So there are, the model of a perfectly competitive market is perfectly fine when you're thinking of the market of apples. But it's not going to be a very useful model if you want to understand how Google works or how Amazon works. Then you have to bring in new models that stresses the importance of information, network effects, about monopoly power.
Exactly.
And we have those models, and each one of these models provide a different aspect of the truth. And the craft of an economist is being able to pick the model that fits the purpose.
So you would say that the 2013 Nobel Prize win for Eugene Fama and Robert Shiller for their opposite conclusions and assumptions for their contribution to asset pricing, you think that was a great step forward then for the economics profession, as I hear you?
Yeah, I mean, people were confused. I mean, why give a prize in the same year to somebody whose main contribution was to emphasize the efficiency of markets, and then give a prize the same year to somebody whose main contribution was to emphasize the inefficiency of markets, the excess volatility. And so a lot of people said, what's really happening here? And my interpretation was, look, both of those are very important elements of how we understand financial markets. If we focus too much on pharma, then we're going to be blindsided to financial crises, and we'll think that they can't happen, or there's nothing we can do about them. If we focus only on the inefficiency, then we might repress financial markets too much, we might have excessive regulation, and we might lose out on some of the benefits of financial innovation, which can often actually benefit the poor.
Okay, and now in relation to you being a professor at Harvard University, we remember the student walkout in 2011 when students protested against the single-minded approach of Professor Mankiw on economics. Do you think nowadays there's much more support for your pluralist view of economics rather than in 2011 when people protested against the single-minded approach?
I think so. I mean, at least, what can I say? I'd like to think so, right? But maybe not as much as we would like to see. I think there is a problem still in introductory economics courses that we're so obsessed with trying to demonstrate how the markets work that we don't demonstrate the richness of our alternative frameworks that show how markets can fail and then what we can do to fix those failures. There is actually, but still, some very good efforts underway. I want to emphasize in particular, there's the core curriculum of economics that's been is being developed by the by Wendy Carlin and her colleagues in England, which I think is bringing much more these diverse perspectives. I think it's much more grounded in the real economy. So I think there are significant advances here.
Is it in particular at your own university, Harvard? Do you see any particular change? Are you in such a huge institution? Do you manage to somehow convince your colleagues, let's say, to start to think differently towards a new way of thinking?
I think it's happening. I mean, I'm lucky that I sit in the part of the university which has already its feet firmly planted on the ground, the public policy school, and there I think we're very used to sort of the diversity of methods and diversity of disciplines and thinking about models as tools that you select according to the need. But I think that economic discipline is changing. I mean, one of the biggest revolutions, of course, in economics, and one of the winner of the Nobel Prize this year is in behavioral economics.
Exactly.
I think that wasn't so long ago that we thought the notion of the rational economic men was so critical to economics that you couldn't possibly work in mainstream economics and abandon the rationality postulate. And yet, behavioral economics does exactly that.
So,
and
students should get a very varied portfolio of efficient market hypotheses on irrationality, and then they can decide themselves later when they're doing research on which models they can use for their own benefit. Okay,
in principle, I mean, that's I think what economics, when it is done well, and in graduate school, that's what it teaches you. Then something happens with the sociology of the profession and with the psychology of the profession, which I think often the problem of circling the wagons takes place on mainstream political issue on policy issues, and I don't think we serve the public very well.
Interesting. Okay, let's move to our main topic of today, which is the discussion on hyperglobalization. We will come to your trilemma later on in the interview. Before we start off, you have written a lot on the causes and consequences of globalization. But in order to make sure we're all on the same page, how would you, in a couple of sentences, describe the phenomenon of hyperglobalization at this moment?
Well, the way that I use the term hyperglobalization is to denote a kind of an ideal type, which in some ways doesn't exist, but it's something that I think we've been pushing towards. And that's a world in which essentially there is no difference between the global market and the national market anymore. There's a difference between local or regional markets and the national market.
Yeah.
So putting it another way is that that borders, national borders, don't exert any significant depressing effects or don't pose transaction costs on trade in goods, services, finance, money, capital. And so that's I want to emphasize that this is an ideal, that I don't think that's where we are now. But many of the things that we try to do, such as the single market, the single money in the Eurozone, is essentially trying to replicate that ideal in the real world.
Okay. So where are we now? In what state are we? Are we in a hyperglobalized world yet?
I don't think so. I don't think even the European Union or the Eurozone is fully hyperglobalized, although it comes fairly close in certain dimensions, especially money. Now, in other areas, the world as a whole, I think, is highly globalized, but I don't think we're at hyperglobalization. But I think the term is useful to draw attention to what we are trying to do with our trade agreements, with our understanding of financial globalization. Is this what we're trying to achieve, or are we trying to achieve something significantly less ambitious?
Yes, because perfect hyperglobalization also prescribes a uniform system of regulation for labor, for example, right? So that seems very far-fetched.
In the limit, of course, it would entail standardization of all kinds of regulations, including labor market regulations, because
Yeah.
when you think about how do you achieve a unified market, you have to have a system where international businesses, companies and firms and investors don't face different regulations in different parts of the
Yes.
world, so that you're minimizing these costs of doing business across the border.
Transaction costs.
And that would entail sort of harmonizing away these differences. And there's another reason that, that when you have differences in these regulations, that you know, people in different parts of the world, you know, don't like it because they want to have a level playing field. They want to compete with companies and workers in other countries on a level playing field. But if you have very large differences in these kinds of regulations, it causes concerns about the fairness of the competition and so forth. So that's why I think in any truly integrated market, such as the national market in the United States or in the Netherlands, you have relatively little differences in different parts of the country. Even if it's a federal system, you have relatively small differences in the rules of competition.
I see. I was wondering to what extent we talked about your, let's say, pluralist view. We call it the tailor-made approach to globalization. To what extent have these designers of globalization applied your tailor-made approach in the real world?
Rather than a one-size-fits-all economy.
Well, if you're asking me if they listened to me, they didn't.
Yeah, I figured the answer.
So,
Hypothetically,
so
afterwards.
my view is that you know, starting with the 1990s really, and I would maybe time this with the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1994, that I think we began to go badly off course in terms of our globalization strategy. I think globalization became an end rather than a means. And I think before, and certainly in the kind of the Bretton Woods system that John Maynard Keynes had designed, the global economy and globalization and international trade and investment were an instrument for achieving domestic economic and social goals. And I think increasingly after the 1980s and the 1990s, the priorities got reversed and the globalization became an end, and every country had to adjust itself, its own objectives, its own social arrangements to the ends of trade agreements or free capital mobility. And I think that was a perversion of priorities, and it was going to create problems, and I think it did.
And which policies were idealized during the Washington Consensus, just for the audience to get a good historical perspective on this case?
Well, yeah, I mean, the Washington Consensus was sort of like a domestic counterpart of this strategy, the notion that, you know, that there is an idealized set of policies in terms of, you know, free markets and, you know, privatized enterprises and
small governments
and relatively small government, which didn't do a whole lot. And that this was the ideal policy regime for all countries.
So the idea was free trade during the 90s. So, but on the other hand, how did the countries that formulated their tailor-made economic policies, rather than following this, you know, this consensus globally, how were they in the end the winners of globalization?
Well, that's in some sense the paradox, because if you look at the big winners of the of globalization after the 1990s, the paradox is that the big winners, such as China, of course, is the biggest by far. China played the globalization game by the rules of the Bretton Woods period, not by the rules that came to prevail after the 1990s. And again, to repeat, after the 1990s, you were supposed to open your trade up, allow yourself free capital mobility and free finance. And the state was supposed to play a very little role in terms of the economy. And of course, what China did, China moved towards markets for sure. It provided market-based incentives. It moves towards private markets. But what it did was, and very wisely, it essentially very carefully managed capital flows, managed its exchange rate, actively engaged in industrial policies and proactive policies of diversifying its economy. and delayed its import liberalization until exports were out, and it was, encouraging exports. So essentially, it did many things that were, completely, prohibited by the playbook of the 1990s and beyond.
Yeah.
Essentially, replicating a kind of a Bretton Woods agenda in a world that was moving towards hyperglobalization. And it has to be said, it benefited from the openness policies of other countries in Europe, particularly the United States, and it could take advantage of those free markets, but sort of always controlling how much it was opening its own economy.
Okay, but so if China was so successful by playing globalization by their own rules, rather than following this consensus that we just discussed, why do you then often blame Donald Trump, for example, if he wants to introduce a tax on foreign competition, let's say the German car manufacturing, if he wants to protect its own industry and its own workers, just as China did in the 1990s and even still now?
I'm not at all against, in principle, pursuing policies that will create some impediments on trade or that on taxes that might be imposed in certain cases on foreign corporations. The point is, what is the objective of doing that? What is it that you're trying to achieve? Now, if you could convince me that what Donald Trump is doing is to, generate more equitable, more inclusive economic and social consequences as a result of his policies, I'd be the first one to be beyond them. But I look at what's on his NAFTA renegotiation agenda. I look at what is in domestic economic policies with tax cuts, deregulation, taking protections away from workers.
But if you just look at his foreign economic policy by imposing a tariff on foreign competition, on their
Well, first of all, he hasn't done that. He's talked about it, and I don't think. But I wouldn't. I think he's talked, for example, of imposing an across-the-board 35% tariff on Chinese imports. I think
You mentioned before that you thought he's never going to do that.
I don't think he's going to do that, but I wouldn't be in favor of it. I think it's sort of that kind of indiscriminate import protection doesn't really achieve anything. I think he was right to. Get out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that sort of big mega trade deal that had been negotiated, because I think on the whole TPP is a bad idea.
Exactly.
So I think that was the right thing to do. But that was an easy thing to do. You just sort of not sign it.
Because you say always, beforehand, it's not good to sign up for a trade deal, but afterwards, with NAFTA, for example, it's not such a smart idea to retreat from that trade agreement, right? Because the damage has already been done. That's what you say.
Well, with NAFTA, I think, yes, there was some damage, and I think that's been done. I don't think renegotiating it is going to bring those jobs back into the US, so I think that's gone. And I think when you look at sort of what it is that he's trying to renegotiate, it's largely another corporate agenda. It's really about, getting tighter patent rules on Mexico. It's really about, getting more market access for American businesses in Mexico, while doing nothing else, in terms of the kind of impediments that exist in the United States. So I look at it. I say, this is really, pure politics. It's just rhetorical, and I think, this is not going to do much to improve, the lives of American workers, especially since, just like NAFTA created some upheavals, it's, abolishing it is now going to create some upheaval somewhere else. In particular, for example, you have the auto industry in the US that relies on these production networks and supply chains with Mexico. If there were significant barriers at the border, I think many jobs would be threatened on account of that.
Yeah. I think we will come back later also to discuss the redistribution and compensation issue within trade agreements. For now, I'm wondering whether there are already audience questions. For Mr. Rodrik, we can only take a few during this interview, so if you have a good question, please raise your hand. Benji, you have the microphone, right? I see here two gentlemen in the front. Please try to ask your question as concise as possible.
Yeah, and also on the topics that we just discussed. We're going to cover a lot of more topics on trade later on.
I'm sorry, you were just going to, as I heard, raise the issue of populism and go over that during the discussion. So I have precisely related to that question. Would you prefer that I ask it now or later?
Later.
I would prefer to ask it later because probably it will be answered.
Okay,
all right?
then secure that one for me.
All right. So the guy next to you.
Yeah, I had a question back at the beginning when we talked about economists losing credibility. What would your views be on how to gain it back? The credibility
Well, I
lost?
think it's one word. I mean, honesty. I mean, I think we should just be honest about the divisions of view and opinion within the economics profession. I think we should do a much better job of reflecting sophisticated economics, not just textbook introductory economics in our public discussions and deliberation. And also, a second word, I think, is modesty or humility. That is that I don't think we should be so quick to comment on policy debates when we don't necessarily know too much about the details. And I think, if you are to ask economists, are you in favor of the TPP? I think most of them would say, yes, we are. And that's because TPP is a trade agreement, and that has the connotation of free trade, and economists are for free trade. The fact is that TPP is thousands and thousands of pages of regulation, much of which has nothing to do with free trade. That doesn't seem to bother us too much. We can still say that we're in favor of it. So I think that's the kind of thing that that we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't overreach, and we should be modest.
But even to comment on this, even the OECD, when calculating the welfare gains for a new trade deal, they always point an X amount of welfare gains and an X amount of jobs created. I mean, are they wrong? Are they using the wrong models to calculate trade welfare gains, or in your view?
Well, let me put it this way. I mean, I think there are a lot of games that you can play with models.
Yeah.
I think there are many different ways in which you can calculate the implications of a trade agreement.
Okay.
I think multilateral institutions like the OECD have had a bias towards working with models that generate the results that they would like to see, and putting in the assumptions that are going to generally tend to increase the benefits while underplaying some of the possibly adverse consequences.
Yeah.
So I think the answer to that is not that we should not have models. I think the answer to that is that we should accept that there could be other models that generate different kinds of predictions.
Yeah, interesting.
Do you think we still have time for one audience question in between? I saw a guy raising his hand over here. Again, try to be concise. Here, bench over here. Yeah. Raise your hands, please. So, yeah.
You were vocal about the criticism of TPP, so I want to ask you, what do you think about TTIP, and whether the Trump made a good decision to not proceed with the negotiations for it?
I think TTIP, shares some of the problems with TPP. I think in particular, the provisions with respect to investor-state dispute settlement are particularly problematic, I think, in the case of the TTIP, because with the TPP you can say that is everybody familiar with ISDS? Is the notion that foreign investors can actually sue governments for regulations or changes in regulations that reduce their profits. So this is a kind of a very weird thing that provides a special legal advantages to corporations to sort of sue domestic governments where nobody else can. And the usual argument why this might be a good thing is that countries with weak legal regimes who want to attract foreign investment might willingly submit themselves to such clauses or such requirements, because it's a way of saying, look, I want you foreign firms, foreign investors to come in and invest. I understand that you think that my legal regime is so bad that I might expropriate you or somebody else might do something that will reduce your profits and you're not going to get remedies within my existing legal system. So I'm going to provide you with this privilege that you can actually sue me in this investment court that's outside my own legal jurisdiction. But, so there's a logic to it. But in the context of the TTIP, which is a bunch of countries, all of which have very strong legal regimes, there's no justification whatsoever. So it's very weird. It doesn't belong there. And I think, so that's, I think, one of the most problematic aspects of TTIP.
And also to add on this, because in your latest research paper, you say that, just as you said now, that in trade agreements, capital is favored and not the working class. But is cheaper consumer goods in result of trade not a perfect example of how trade trickles down to the working class?
Well, if you're a worker who loses his job or who's displaced or have to, take a much lesser paying jobs, I mean, the fact that, prices have gone down in his or her local supermarket is only partially a compensation. It doesn't compensate for the full economic burden. So that's sort of one thing, is that, that there are, even when you figure in the consumer benefits of lower prices, there are real distributional effects that some groups are going to lose out.
But shouldn't we look at purchasing power rather than wages, for example? Because
no, that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that economics teaches is no matter which way you look at it, if you do the calculation correctly in terms of the purchasing power of your income and just not your nominal wages, what I just said is true. There are always going to be some workers or some groups who are going to be worse off. And for those of you who are economists in the audience, the one requirement for this to be true is that for there to be import competing production at home. As long as there is production at home that's directly competing with imports, then what I said is true. There will always be some groups that will be not relative, actually absolute losers from trade. And that's what trade theory teaches.
Let's get to your trilemma. You wrote a book in 2000, or you published a book in 2011 called the Globalization Trilemma. The Globalization Paradox. Yeah.
I wanted to say trilemma. My publisher wouldn't let me. He said, nobody's going to buy a book that's called Globalization Trilemma. So the trilemma became a paradox. You would.
You argue in this book that there's some kind of an inescapable trilemma between democracy, nation-state, and hyperglobalization. Could you, before we dive into the discussion on this, could you briefly explain to the audience, for the ones who don't know this trilemma yet, could you explain why is this the case? Why are those three elements mutually incompatible?
So the trilemma states that you cannot have simultaneously hyperglobalization, the nation-state, and democracy. And I think the best way to understand it is to have a very quick historical tour. So if we go back to the very first era of globalization, that's the gold standard. What was the gold standard? The rules of the gold standard were that essentially there was free and complete capital mobility, and every country had a fixed exchange rate vis-a-vis gold. So you did everything to open your country to the flow of capital and money and finance. And that essentially meant that policy had to be restrained to pursue any objective other than the objectives that were compatible with the rules of the gold standard. That meant that your interest rates were basically determined by global conditions, and there was nothing you could do to manage. So that's the kind of world in which your domestic economic policies are completely constrained by the requirement of just being completely open to world economy and global finance in particular. Now that system collapsed particularly because of that weakness, that when people wanted the economy to be reflated, when there was high unemployment and people were looking for the government to manage the economy, to print more money, to reduce interest rates, the governments first said, no, we can't do it because the rules of the gold standard doesn't allow us. Eventually, as in Britain, eventually in 1931, people said we're not going to have this anymore, and the central bank had to get off. Bank of England went off gold.
Because in that case, the nation state is ignored, right? Because no domestic policies can be pursued.
No, in that case, you have the nation state, but the only policies that the nation state pursues are those that are compatible with the gold standard, and therefore what you don't have is democracy, because you have no way that the government economic policy can respond. So the classical gold standard worked as long as you had, regimes where you didn't have a mass media, where you didn't have a universal franchise, where economic policy, didn't really respond to democratic electoral pressures. Now, in the period after the Second World War, Keynes essentially said, in this world where we have democracies, there's no way that we can replicate the experience of the gold standard. So in Keynes's vision of the world economy, that which he put into effect with the Bretton Woods institutions after 1944, was that we will combine the nation state and democracy, but we will keep hyperglobalization at bay. So he said, we're not going to have full capital mobility. In fact, we'll have capital controls. And that was part of the deal, that you insulate domestic economic policy from the ups and downs of international capital flows, and you provide space for a national economic policy making. So that's the second possibility. The third, in some ways, is where you get rid of the nation state and you say, okay, I like democracy, I like globalization, but let's build it at the global level. Or maybe for Europe, let's build it at European regional level. But that means owning up to the fact that national sovereignty won't exist, that all policy will be made at the level of Brussels, and all politics will be at the level of Brussels, and there won't be much national sovereignty below that.
Let's get to this Brussels example you mentioned. In an interview with Taylor Cohen in 2015, you mentioned that it was about Europe and the European Union, and you mentioned that if it was up to you, considering your globalization trilemma, you would go full steam on federal integration and thereby undermine the sovereignty of the nation state. I was wondering, doesn't that contradict with your with this view, in the sense that why would you choose to go full steam on federal integration, thus choosing for hyperglobalization? Why did you choose
Why is Europe the other case in this example?
Well, I think we find ourselves now in Europe in a very kind of an unbalanced integration process where on the economic dimensions, we've already gone significantly, as I said earlier, in the direction of hyperglobalization. In principle, we have a single currency. In particular, we have a single currency. Now, this is the reality that we're living with. Now, if we were not here, but we were talking about it 20 years ago, when this step had not yet been taken, I might have viewed it differently. But right now, the reality is we have a single currency. So
But you can step out of that single currency.
I'm sorry?
But you can step out of that single currency. It's not an obligation.
You can step out, but that's the thing. That's going to be incredibly costly.
Okay.
So that's one of the possibilities. One way we'll re-establish the balance between economic integration and political integration is we have less economic integration. So we bring economic integration back to where the politics is, at the level of nation states. That does mean getting out of the Eurozone. But that's, I can tell you that this would be extremely disruptive, extremely costly.
You constantly actually say that once we're already there, it's more damaging to get out of it than to rethink how we should be dealing with it. I'm asking this because you recently published a paper as well on populism in relation to trade. What we see nowadays is that populist leaders, especially in Europe, constantly get back to the importance of nationalism, to get back to the importance of the nation state. Don't you think that this choice of further hyperglobalization in Europe rather than, choosing for the further globalization instead of choosing for the nation states doesn't only further trigger the rise of populism? You see what I mean?
It does, exactly. But I think part of it is because I think the political elites in Europe and as well as elsewhere have not faced up to the trilemma. In other words, they have essentially told their people that we will have our democracy function as it always was. We will keep pushing for the single market. And nothing will happen to national sovereignty. That it won't be eroded, and we will still have self-determination. And because they haven't, been honest about this, and because they have overpromised, and I think part of the reaction is that we are giving up something, and you told us we weren't going to give up, and therefore, it becomes expressed in terms of a populist backlash.
But don't you think that therefore it will only worsen once you choose now? We look at Emmanuel Macron, we see Angela Merkel, they say we take up the lead. Indeed, it seems like they choose for your option as well, further hyperglobalization. Isn't that only going to worsen, again, it's the same question, but isn't that only going to worsen this problem of populism?
So what I'm arguing for is not for more hyperglobalization. What I'm arguing for the deepening the institutional, political, fiscal underpinnings of a hyperglobalization that's already there. So that's what I'm arguing for. But it's a legitimate question to say whether, in fact, that's a vote winner or not. So for a politician, Angela Merkel is not interested in this. Macron, to some extent, is. But it's not at all entirely clear that, going to the French electorate and saying, I want to get rid of French national sovereignty. In return, we will have, we'll erect a European Union that's fully sovereign, that's a quasi-federal entity. I'm not sure that necessarily that this would be a big vote getter for him or for any other, quasi-federal movement. So that's the problem. I think that's the issue, and I think it's a problem that's been exacerbated by the way that the euro crisis has been dealt with, because I think the response to the crisis was not an expression of greater solidarity, but it was an expression that took the form of a morality play. There were good guys and the bad guys, and the Greeks and the Spaniards had misbehaved, and they had to be now put in place. That's not the kind of line that really calls for a lot of solidarity on the part of creditors in the Netherlands or creditors in Germany.
But there seems also to be some contradiction in that you say that Europe should head for full economic integration. Because so far in your books, but also during this interview, you've said that domestic economies function best in a decentralized manner. Are Germany and Portugal, for example, not two totally different economies with two totally different policy necessities that would just benefit much more from tailor-made economics rather than a straitjacket in Europe, for example?
It's entirely possible. I mean, it's entirely possible whether Europe contains economies that have significantly different needs and need to be dealt with very different institutional arrangements and policies. And in which case, then we'll have to find out a way of clawing ourselves way back from the kind of single market and single currency in which we have placed ourselves in. But let's not. But my plea is first, let's understand that these trade-offs are real. Second, let's be honest about which ones we're going to be pursuing. And third, if you want me to say that maybe we should push back from single market and single currency, and let's be honest that this is going to be very costly, and that we better do that in full with full recognition of the costs.
Let's move over to another important aspect of hyperglobalization, and that is, of course, trade deals. Because in your research, you show that when two countries sign up for a free trade deal when existing tariffs are already very low, that the net marginal gains are very small and that the redistributional effects on the other side are very large. Would you then say that Japan and the EU are now negotiating a free trade deal? Would you then say that they are wasting their time and human capital? Or?
Well, I think that the EU-Japan agreement is more sort of a psychological a gain rather than anything. It's a way of Europe in particular to demonstrate that despite Trump,
political message, right?
This thing is, and I think there's some value to that. But I do think that most trade agreements, and I haven't studied, I have to be honest, I haven't studied the contents of the, so I should live, to
the first point,
to
right?
the first point about modesty and humility and not making sort of judging
so far,
things
so good,
without having.
anyway.
Well, thank you. But so I don't know about the EU-Japan trade agreement, but most trade agreements that I've looked at are a waste of human and political capital relative to what else we could be doing.
Exactly.
Because what you argue is actually that due to this trade deals, the redistribution effect is excessive. You say that some people lose a lot while some people gain a lot. What group in particularly loses from this trade agreement?
What is the direct effect of redistribution?
Well, I mean, I think we have good empirical studies, let's say for the United States, of the consequences of NAFTA or the consequences of China's entry into WTO, and we know the losers tend to be, particularly blue-collar workers, relatively less skilled workers, in working industries that tended to be relatively highly protected beforehand, and therefore when tariffs came down vis-a-vis Mexico or China was a big exporter, their jobs became threatened. And not only them, but also people who tend to live in the same communities, because I think in these communities the closure of a factory has ripple effects that others
Is that the
feel.
dualist dimension that you often talk about?
Well, it has to do with the fact that, I mean, one of the consequences of international economic integration is that it's produced a certain amount of domestic disintegration. That is that the gap between, the people who have access to the global networks and have the international mobility and those who don't, I think that gap has increased. And that gap doesn't always take the form of income inequality, because, for example, in the Netherlands or in Sweden, it's not like income inequality has become significantly worse, but nevertheless, this social gap or the cognitive gap about sort of, what, you think the government ought to be doing, that gap still has increased.
Is that gap in the Netherlands not so large because we have a welfare state here? That you can say maybe welfare state and an open economy are two sides of the same coin, and that we are doing that very, very well here in the Netherlands.
I've heard that before.
Yeah? What of you, maybe?
Yes, I do think that the welfare state and the open economy are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And I think that explains, for example, why in the Dutch context, many aspects of free trade are not controversial. You guys aren't discussing here whether, you should, trade with China or not, or whether you should have trade barriers against China. Even the populists in the Netherlands, right, in the Netherlands, for them, those aspects of trade don't matter.
Yes.
There are other aspects, like in the TTIP that I was asked for, the ISDS, the regulation of
environment.
So those are conflicts about values. They're conflicts about whether it should be, who should have control, whether it's labor versus capital, or the sort of democratic accountability. So those are still highly controversial. In the United States, the direct income effect, employment effects of trade remain controversial because the United States doesn't have the kind of welfare state that the Netherlands has. So I think you see that the welfare state has at least meant that in countries like the Netherlands or most other European countries, a lot of aspects of free trade is no longer politically controversial.
Because you often, or like the political elites often argue that globalization has actually only winners, and this is because the losers, once they are properly compensated, also become winners. You don't seem to agree with this, reading your papers, right? So we have the case of the Netherlands, in which we say, well, a trade deal might lead to a distribution effect which is not desirable, but as long as we compensate, everyone becomes a winner. This is something you disagree with, right?
No, I don't disagree with it.
Okay.
I mean, I think regular free trade is that, yes. I mean, if you compensate people, that you can make everybody a winner. So the trouble is that we don't, and therefore, you have to deal with the reality as you find it.
Yeah. Time inconsistency, right? That's how you mentioned it before.
Yes, I think in the US the problem has been that, that even though the government has repeatedly promised to compensate, I think once trade agreements are signed, that the political incentive to actually spend resources on compensation aren't there.
Because the office changes after 5 years or 4 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, going back to the previous question, I mean, but again, I want to emphasize that a lot of the opposition to trade agreements is not simply about income losses. That there are significant debates and legitimate debates about, what we should be doing in trade agreements. It's about the, what kind of rules we want. And I think people who are very concerned about investor-state dispute settlement, or people who are very concerned about many aspects of harmonization of regulations. They're not concerned because they think that their incomes are going to go down. They're concerned because they feel
right?
It's about fundamental principles, values, democratic accountability, and views about who should have the upper hand in designing these kinds of rules. So that's the sense in which is, compensation doesn't care of those kinds of differences.
Once it works, it's good, but it doesn't in most of the countries.
It's not consistent, right? Yeah. Is there maybe a audience question in the public? And I turn to you, of course.
The question hasn't been answered.
That's right.
Yeah, hello again. So you've raised an issue of populism in Europe, and I would like to know, wouldn't you say that those Eurosceptical groups of politicians in Europe, which are often accused of populism, they actually don't oppose free trade agreements, and they don't oppose free market, but instead of that, they support more national sovereignty of their states within those trade agreements, and they oppose really transformation of trade unions, because European single market has been existing since 1951. They oppose transformation of those trade unions into some political unions where, for example, some governmental structures from Brussels or a German government, they try to dictate other countries which fiscal policy to design, and whether to accept or not to accept refugees, and whether interest rates should be higher or lower, because there is just one bank that sets up interest rates and it prevents a deliberate choice of fiscal policy. So, yeah, that's the main question.
To keep it concise question, but thank you.
So I mean, I think what we can say about populists in their favor is that they have internalized the trilemma, which is that they are honest about that as you say, they want to combine their understanding of democracy with national sovereignty, and they say maintaining national sovereignty is good because this way we can decide our monetary policy, we can decide our own immigration policy and who we're taking in or not. So they're very explicit about which sort of corner of the trilemma they want, and they want to keep hyperglobalization at bay.
So we can look at good populism in a good manner as well, because it
would be good if you accept their conception of democracy and their conception of who is the nation state. I think my objection to most of the populists, and in Europe it mostly takes a right-wing form, is that the nation state is defined in ethno-nationalist terms. That is, it's defined in terms of underlying ethnicity and religion, rather than as an inclusive citizenship.
Exactly.
And I think that's the main problem with right-wing populism. It's not that it says we should pursue the national interest, because that should be legitimately the role of what governments do, but that it is defined in a kind of a nativist, an ethno-nationalistic way, rather than an inclusive way.
You could say that a lot of indeed, that's maybe when we talk about the AfD or Geert Wilders, for example, but you could say that populism like in Greece, for example, Syriza definitely contributes to the question and to the debate on whether globalization is the right form we should take, right? Hyperglobalization. I can imagine that there are good sides in that.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very valuable point, that we shouldn't paint all populists in the same nativist and regressive kind of light. It's worth remembering also that in the United States, populism has a very long history. In fact, the first self-consciously populist movement was in the United States in the tail end of the 19th century. Yeah. And those populists were against the gold standard. So in a way, they were reacting also to the intrusions in the domestic sphere of the world economy. But that most US American historians think of US populism as a progressive force, because it was essentially directed at eliminating some of the domestic economic injustices at the time. So I think similarly, I would say that Bernie Sanders, who represents a kind of left populist, I think was a progressive force. And I believe he had many ideas that were quite good.
Yeah, so in this sense, we don't talk about populism necessarily as a bad thing, if I understand. All right, we have talked a lot about the consequences, but we haven't talked really about the solutions. It seems there's a lot of doom and gloom, but I'm wondering, are you somewhat hopeful that we're going to solve this issue, that we move forward?
I mean, first, I do think that that some elements of left populism is the right way to go. I think in the United States we would have been better off with Bernie Sanders, and I think that's because, what we have in a country like the United States is a system that has been thoroughly corrupted by the influence of money and financial interests in politics. And I think, the Bernie Sanders' emphasis on breaking that link, I think is right on target, and I think we should have gone in that direction. And I think to varying extent, the same is true in many other countries as well, in the sense that of the capture of the politics by a particular set of financial and professional elites. So I think breaking this link will have to be the solution, and I think it's only the left, in some sense, that can provide that solution, and that has to respond in the appropriate way. Am I optimistic that this can happen? I am. I think that market capitalism and the mixed economy have gone through many different processes of re-engineering, and I think that capitalism can reform itself. It has reformed itself in history, and I think it's going to eventually happen. So I think I see no necessary gloom and doom at the end of the road. I don't see very many movements right now which have adopted that agenda, so we may have to wait for things to get a little bit worse before they get better.
Because in your new book, Straight Talk on Trade, you present the reader some ideas for a sane world economy. As a cliffhanger for the audience, could you present your two most profound policy changes that the world has to undertake in order to get to this world
But then they won't buy the book.
Maybe they will after.
So it isn't here yet, right?
Two ideas. Well, one idea is to incorporate a clause on social dumping in our trade agreements. The second idea is for the government to set up public venture funds that will be co-owner of robots and new digital technologies as a way of socializing the benefits of the new innovation.
It's good. Yeah, we asked this question just as a cliffhanger, so actually more people will buy your book. That's but just to be sure, it's not out in the Netherlands yet, right? So it's.
It is. I believe it's out. I believe you can get it on Amazon. I believe.
On Amazon. All right.
Bob.com later this month. I looked it up this
later
morning.
this month. Okay.
You will also later this day you will give the Timberg-lezing at the Dutch Central Bank. There will be a lot of established Dutch economists there. Will you convince those Dutch economists about your views on globalization and your pluralist view on economics?
Well, I mean, giving the Tinbergen lecture is a big honor, and I'm very gratified and honored to have been invited. And since they invited me, they're willing to listen. So that's all I can say.
Okay, and because you once mentioned, as a last question, you once mentioned that the problem in economics is not the profession, it's the economists itself. And when I turn to the audience, I see a lot of young potential future economists. So do you maybe have some last advisory words for them?
Well, don't be discouraged to be an economist. You may lose some friends, but
Have you?
I think I've lost some friends among my economists. But I do think it's a phenomenally powerful way to study and understand society. I encourage everybody here with interest in economics to proceed in that direction.
All right, thank you. That's a great message. Before we're gonna we can have an applause already, but that will be only the first one, because I think you're the first guest this year that will receive two times an applause today. Because I was about to make a couple of announcements. First of all, it's good to know that the applications to become an interviewer at Room for Discussion are open. I believe the deadline is on the 17th of November. In case you have any questions already about the committee, about, I don't know, practical issues, then you can ask, I think, Benji or, and a couple students that will be around after the interview, in case you're interested. Yeah. Secondly, there will be an interview next week on Big Pharma with Marcel Levy, next Thursday. And lastly, before we thank Mr. Rodrik, we would like to make a special thanks to the Dutch Central Bank, who also accommodated the interview for today. For now, I think it only rests me to say thank you very much for coming, and a special thanks for Professor Rodrik, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.